what Continental wants is what this indicates essentially is the number of shares of the target that the acquirer has, number of shares of the acquirer that the target is going to receive in return for each of its shares. So, in other words, number of shares of Continental that a number of shares of United that Continental is going to receive in return for each of its shares should the transaction go through. Now, what Continental wants is the 30-day average. So let me just, this is just eyeballing, but something like this. So Continental essentially wants a higher, more shares of United. And United wants to give out fewer shares. So there's a bit of disagreement about this. Now, what we are going to do is perform an exchange ratio exercise, which is going to be very similar to the exercises that you will have to do during your exam. So the big question over here is what should be the exchange ratio? What you have here is the pre-announcement. And the post-announcement. So exactly the same thing that you saw in the graph, the two circle portions, pre and post-announcement. These are the outstanding shares. So I'm just using an abbreviation that's outstanding. Outstanding shares of Continental and United at the moment, that is without issuing any new shares. So the big question for us is what is the exchange ratio, which is also the target stock price divided by the acquirer's stock price, or the number of shares of the acquirer that the target is going to receive in return for each of its shares. So the first question I have over here is, just by looking at this particular table, can someone tell me exactly what the synergies are? So if I were to look at this, how would I calculate the synergy or the value increase that would potentially result from this particular deal?
Sorry, Matteo.
Either of you can answer. I'm perfectly comfortable both ways.
No, you can answer, Matteo.
Matthew, you're muted.
Sorry. So I was thinking about the market cap on the 30th of April minus the market cap of the 6th.
That is exactly right. So I will refer to my calculations if you do not mind, so that I can, without having to do everything on the calculator at the moment, I can just give you the answers. So that is exactly right. This is the market's belief of what the synergy will be, essentially. So the market believes that the synergies here will be worth 554 million. And to identify the exchange ratio in this case, what we have to do is we have to first decide how much of these synergies are going to be split between the two parties. Now, towards the end of the next lecture slides, that is the one that deals with valuation, we will discuss a bit about how these synergies are split between the acquirer and the target. But what we will go with right now is that United wants to pay, say, half of these synergies to Continental. Now, where do I come up with this half value? It's just a completely arbitrary value that I came up with in the moment. It's not something which is, the actual outcome. But also, one good thing about this half value is that it will provide a benchmark against which you can compare the actual outcome of this case. So by looking at this half and by looking at the final value, you can actually decipher, in a sense, how much of the synergies were paid, whether it was more than half or less than half. And this will help us determine the exchange ratio. So now if United has to pay something to Continental, it's going to pay entirely in shares. And because of that, this exchange ratio starts playing a big role. So there are two methods of going about this. If you're asking me personally, I prefer the second method, but let's start off with the first, more complicated method. So what United has to pay to Continental, I'm just going, yeah. So that works out to the Continental's pre-announcement value plus half of synergies. Why is it pre-announcement value and not post-announcement value?
Because the post-announcement value already includes some portion of the synergies reflected by the market.
Exactly right. So the post-announcement value already includes synergies. So if you are going to pay someone a portion of the synergies plus half of the synergies, you're no longer paying them half of the synergies, you're paying a higher value. So as a result of that, you just take the pre-announcement value plus half of the synergies. So as a result of this, what is going to happen is that Continental ends up with a fraction F of the final company. So this is to put a specific idea, give you an idea of where this F is, what this F is. F is the share of the combined company which Continental shareholders are going to hold. So let me just delineate this. Yes. So the idea is that F is simply the percentage of the final company that Continental shareholders own. I hope I can do a good job of drawing a circle. No, I did not. So this would work out something like this is the F, or what Continental owns, and the rest is what United owns, and this is the total merged company. Now, the only way that Continental ends up with this F is when United issues shares to Continental's shareholders. Because remember, United is a separate company, Continental is a separate company. So Continental's shareholders can buy into United only when United issues them shares. Okay, so let's start off first by identifying this F. That's the first step. What exactly is F? So F should be the amount that United pays to Continental. Let me just actually refer to this as, I don't know what to call it. Let me just say New Continental. Okay, so that's New Continental divided by the combined company. Actually, let me refer to this as payment. That will make it clearer. Okay. So that should be equal to, in this case, 277, which is half of the synergies, plus the pre-announcement price, which is 2939, divided by the post-announcement combined company, which is 6898. That works out to 3216 divided by 6898, and that is 0.466 or 46.6%. That's actually not the right symbol. 46.6% of the combined company is going to be held by United shareholders. If everything is clear, then I'll proceed to the next step. Otherwise, just unmute yourself and ask a question. Now, the next question is, how many shares should United issue to Continental shareholders such that they end up with this F? So, how many new shares? Just going to zoom in a bit here. So let's call this new shares N. So F is simply the percentage of the new company which is held by Continental shareholders. So that works out to N divided by N plus United's existing shares. United's existing shares. Let me just call that S. So these are the existing shares of United. And that is 0.466 is equal to N divided by N plus how many shares did United have previously? It was 174.49. And if you do this calculation, then you get N as 152.45. So these are million shares. So what is happening over here is that now we have to determine how many new shares have to be issued by United to Continental so that Continental ends up with that F share, F percentage of the total company as ownership. Now we arrive at that F value or F percentage based on this initial synergies. So what I want you to pay attention to here is, if I can actually find a way to go back, is that all of it starts with the decision to pay half of the synergies, and that decision to pay really relies upon the bargaining because neither Continental nor United want to end up with a bad deal. So what they will do is that they will try to get as many of the synergies between themselves. Now that really depends on their bargaining skills, something which is beyond the scope of this course. If you're interested in that, there are some very interesting, courses on negotiation and management, which deal with how this bargaining power plays into negotiations, and also the initial bargaining power to begin with. That's their fundamental bargaining power. So all of it starts with this decision to pay half the synergies, which gives us F, which is the precise percentage of the new company that Continental will end up with, and that gets us to N. That's number of shares. Now that we have the number of shares, the next step is quite straightforward, which is just to identify the exchange ratio. So what should be the exchange ratio? So exchange ratio would be how many shares of existing shares of Continental, that is, these are the existing pre-announcement shares, basically how many new shares should be issued per existing share of Continental. So what are these? These are new shares to be issued. These are pre-merger shares. So for each pre-merger share, how many new shares? And if you do this calculation, that gets us to R is equal to 1.09. So United should give Continental 1.09 per existing share. That gives us the exchange ratio. Now, let us head back to where we started from, which is what United and Continental wanted. Okay, which is what United and Continental wanted. Continental wants something like this. So this is Continental's position. And this is what United wants. And if half of the synergies are paid out, then we end up somewhere over here. So we are, both of them kind of want the extreme end, which is exactly the idea. Each of them essentially wants the maximum amount of synergies that they can capture. So are there any questions so far? Okay.
Where does the 113.6 comes from?
Sorry, I missed you. I could not hear you clearly. Can you repeat that?
The 100.
The 100. What are you referring to? I'm sorry, your voice is a bit muffled. This one are you talking about? I'm sorry, I cannot hear you, Pedro. So if you can type your question in the chat, then maybe I can answer it.
Yeah, I guess the question was targeted towards the 139.6.
I see.
Where this is coming from.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I could not hear you previously. So this comes from here. So these are the pre-announcement existing shares of that company. So these are something that we already know from the data of the company, and essentially what we are trying to figure out in this particular equation is for the existing shares, pre-merger existing outstanding shares, how many new shares should be issued. Does that answer your question? Okay. So the next method is a bit simpler. This was a very convoluted way of answering this question. The less convoluted way of answering this question is something like the exchange ratios formula, which is simply the target share price divided by the acquirer share price. So what we do in this method is we first calculate the target share price, the acquirer share price, and then we just divide one by the other. That gives us the third. The exchange ratio is something we refer to as R. So the first step is target share price. And the way we identify that is simply the market cap pre-announcement plus half of synergies, because that is the deal that we agreed to, divided by the number of outstanding shares. And if we just plug in all the values that we already did in the previous slide, that's 3216 divided by 139.6, which gives us $23.04. Do the exact same thing with the acquirer share price, and that's a calculation that I leave up to you. That works out to 3682 divided by 174.9, and that works out to 21.05. Now, one thing I want to point out over here is that the numerator over here is essentially the same thing, which is market cap pre-announcement plus half of the synergies. The reason being that United also retains half of the synergies. And that gives us step 3, very straightforward calculation, which is just 23.04 divided by 21.05, which works out to once again 1.09 per continental share. Personally, I'm a big fan of this method because it's less convoluted, but it really depends on whichever method that you prefer. You can go with that one. So let us now try to understand what exactly happened. What happened was that the two companies or the two airlines agreed for an exchange ratio of 1.05 United shares for each continental share. Based on a calculation of half of synergies being paid by United to Continental, the value was 1.09 of United share per Continental share. So essentially, Continental ended up with a slightly worse deal. Is that really, slightly worse deal if they had equal bargaining power and ability to bargain as well? So what we had calculated was this value, in case there was half of synergies. What we ended up with was something like 1.05, which is slightly lower. This is what actually happened. And this implies that United captures more of synergies from the final deal as compared to Continental. Is this necessarily a worse deal for Continental in the perspective of, fairness? We really do not know, because it's perfectly possible that United is the one who's creating most of these synergies. So if anything, they are just capturing their fair share. But from the perspective of Continental shareholders, this means that they get fewer shares compared to what they would have gotten had they received this ratio, or even a ratio which gave them half of the synergies. So which is precisely why the exchange ratio both reflects the exact amount which is being paid in dollar terms, but at the same time it also reflects the precise amount of synergies which are being shared between the acquirer and the target. Yeah. So let me just repeat this exercise in case you're also paying with a cash component. Let me add the word component here. So the example that we covered with respect to this is Facebook paying Instagram with, if I remember correctly, $300 million worth of cash and $700 million at the time when the deal was struck of stock. This is a paying with both sort of scenario. Now, in this case, using the second method, you'll have the exact same approach, which is the exchange ratio is just going to be the target's worth or stock price minus the cash per share which is paid divided by the acquirer's stock price. Now, why do we subtract over here cash per share? Because of the very simple fact that we are already making that payment to the target, so we do not want to double pay them. But the entire method is the same. First, calculate the stock price of the target, then calculate the acquirer's stock price, then subtract the cash per share, and then you end up with exchange ratio. So when you pay with cash component, that's how we calculate the exchange ratio. From the perspective of the exam, you will be required to calculate an exchange ratio. The calculations will not be any more difficult in the sense that we will not be having anything which is not covered during the class itself. Yeah, Mateusz, you had a question?
Sorry, I was unmuted. So.
So The idea is that you will basically have the exact same level of calculation. It might just have more additional ingredients, but besides that, we will not be covering something which has not been covered in class. But these are the sort of calculations that you can expect in the exam. I might specify, for instance, that you have to calculate using the first method as opposed to the second method. But if no method has been specified, you can choose either one so long as you arrive at the right answer. So that takes care of the exchange ratio and the example that we rushed through at the end of the last class. Now, let us now move on a bit more to embedding options in the payments, after which we'll cover takeover defenses, and then finally we'll move on to the valuation or the core portion of this course. So when there is a payment method being chosen, one of the central dimensions which drives the payment choice is risk. How much of the risk is being shared between the acquirer and the target? To give you a very specific example, in this particular case, in the previous case, Continental and United, Continental is going to continue sharing the risk of the final deal because it's not receiving a specific amount in cash. There's no definite payment. There's a very good chance that the deal goes through and the shares of the final company, the share price of the final company or the combined company ends up much worse than what it would have otherwise. So in that sense, as a Continental shareholder, if you do not sell off immediately or before, because you cannot sell off before you receive the share, you're incurring a lot of risk because you have an obligation to stay in the company. So on the other hand, if United were to pay Continental entirely in cash, then in that case, Continental shareholders just get a one-time payment, but they cannot share any of the risk. And risk goes both ways. There's also the upside risk and the downside risk. So they cannot also share any positive future performance of this company and capitalize on that. So risk plays a big role. But just as there is this big upside risk, there's the big downside risk. And one solution to maintaining this risk, which can arise during the mergers process, is that you kind of put caps on the risk by creating this option-like arrangement. Now, what do we mean over here by option in terms of, a finance definition? What exactly is an option in finance?
It's an instrument that allows you to use the right or not. Like in the case of the CVR that you are talking there, it's a protective put. I don't know, you have a lot of types. But basically you have the choice, for example, to sell the stock at one point or not, or buy more. It depends.
That's exactly right. So an option is basically a financial instrument which gives you the right but not the obligation to purchase or sell a given share. An option is built upon an underlying asset, which is in many cases something like a share. Now, within the context of this particular course, the options that we are talking about are closer to something like real options, which are options which give the firm the flexibility to say start or end a project. But nonetheless, if you were to really write them down if you were to really calculate them, the value of these real options, it would work out very similar. The calculation method would be quite similar to calculating financial options. But what the summary of this is that an option is essentially a right but not an obligation to do something. That is typically within the stock market to buy or sell an underlying asset. So what you can do over here is embed options within your payment method. So the payment choice whether it's cash or whether it's stock, you can create these sort of option type agreements so that you can limit both your upside and your downside risk. Now, the first two type of options are built upon assets or the value of assets or future performance of the company. And the last two are just linked to any fluctuation in the payment value. And by embedding these options in your payment method during the process or even after the process, you can minimize your risk as an acquirer as well as a target. What you will typically see is that it's not just a one-sided risk management, it is management of risk by both parties who are involved in this process. So now let us consider a particular case. Microsoft acquires Wunderlist. So Wunderlist was this task management company, which was not exactly a large company, and then Microsoft acquired Wunderlist and created this new app called To-Do, which I presume many of you can access on your Windows laptops or even otherwise. The idea being that Wunderlist is this private firm, and there's a lot of information asymmetry about the precise nature of the assets of Wunderlist. So the reason there's an information asymmetry is because private firms or privately held firms are typically not subject to the exact same degree of requirement in terms of reporting, as opposed to public firms whose shares are often traded, public firms whose shares are always traded publicly, and therefore the market does the job of, and information intermediaries do the job of acquiring this information about these public firms, which causes them to be more efficient. So when you're acquiring a private firm, as we covered in the first class, many times you might want to pay a little bit of discount, which is quite good for the acquirer. But at the same time, because there's information asymmetry about the performance of the company, as well as about the assets held by this company, you might want to incorporate these options so that you do not end up with a bad deal ex post. So a post-closing price adjustment is precisely that type of an option. What it does is that it says that a portion of the purchase price is held back, and typically it's held in something called an escrow account, which is an account with the third party, or a third party, typically a lawyer, and this is till some post-merger condition is satisfied. So in this case, Microsoft will purchase Wunderlist, say, using cash. And because it has information asymmetries, it is not precisely aware about what the assets of Wunderlist are worth. What Microsoft will do is that it will pay a portion of this cash into an escrow account. Now, once there is an audit of Wunderlist's assets, then in that case, Microsoft will, the escrow or the escrow lawyer will basically transfer this held back amount into Wunderlist's account. So there will be a third party with an escrow lawyer, which will receive this payment, a portion of the payment, and then transfer to Wunderlist, so long as certain audit conditions are satisfied. What this does, transferring it into a third party, is that it reduces the bargaining power of this purchaser. So in this case, the option value is deriving from potential reduction in the asset value of targets, which is precisely what I said, that is information asymmetry about the assets. If the assets are really worth much less, then that payment will not go through, and Microsoft will manage to, rescue some of the loss which might be resulting by Wunderlist not being completely honest and transparent about the deal itself, about the status of its assets. And because the asset belonged to the target, the cost of ad audit is shared by both the target as well as the acquirer. So a post-closing price adjustment in that sense protects the acquirer from the target being dishonest about the status of its assets. And one dimension where the target or Wunderlist in this case is actually being protected is whereby the amount is being transferred to a third party, which ensures that the payment is made through should Wunderlist be honest about the amount. So this is the first type of an option that you can embed into payment, and this typically comes into action once the actual payment or the deal has been struck. The second dimension or the second way a company like Microsoft can protect itself is through something called an earnout. So let us go once again to Microsoft taking over a company like Wunderlist. And what Microsoft does in this case is that it pays a portion immediately of the payment but then it also pays a portion of the payment conditional on performance of Wunderlist. So once again, Wunderlist, being a small private company, does not receive all the benefits or the entire payment at one go. In this case, Microsoft conditions the payment upon the performance of Wunderlist. So what happens in this case is that Microsoft typically allows the management of Wunderlist to stay in place, and it is run as a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft. So Microsoft does take over Wunderlist, but Wunderlist management stays in place and continues to run the company as a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft. And the incentive of Wunderlist management in this case, because there's this performance condition, is to first of all be honest ex ante about the state of the performance of the company, because many private companies are not really held to any reporting standards. And in addition, to continue operating the business as well as possible once the takeover has gone through, which also reduces for Microsoft any integration issues which might result by changing the management suddenly. So to precisely give you an example of how an earnout works, this is the portion of the payment which is made immediately. So this is the immediate payment. Let's say that it's in cash. And the remaining payment is something like a condition on the post-acquisition. So this is the condition. What this condition says over here is that the net operating cash flow, the excess of the net operating cash flow over the projected cash flows multiplied by 4. So both Microsoft and Wunderlist sit together and they decide upon a projection of cash flows. And Microsoft tells Wunderlist management that if your actual cash flows exceed the projected cash flows by a margin, then you will receive 4 times this excess. Now, what Microsoft has also done is it has embedded an option from its own end in case the actual cash flows exceed the projected cash flows by a very large margin, and that option is here. So there's it's not like an unlimited upside potential for payment. So if this excess is, say, I don't know, something like 400 million, excess times 4 is 400 million, Microsoft still ends up paying 100 million. So in that sense, it caps this bonus from efficiency. So from the perspective of Microsoft, it's maintaining this option to pay a certain amount, which is conditional on future performance, and it's capping the actual amount that will be paid out. So in practice, given this example, let me find my notes. Just give me a second so that I don't have to go back and forth between the two slides. Yeah. So the earnout in this case is going to be the projected cash flows. So these are projected, these are realized or actual for each year. It's year 1, year 2, and year 3. And in this case, this would be the excess for the first year would be 35 minus 20, or this amount, plus 32 minus 22, plus 35 minus 25, divided by 3. That's the average per each year, multiplied by 4, and that value works out to 46.67 million. Now this is less than $100 million. And what this effectively does is that it provides the management with the payment of 46.67 million, like a bonus, for running this company more effectively. Now, from the perspective of Microsoft, that's the acquirer's perspective, what is happening is that there is, so I'm just putting down the total excess value. So if you add up the numerator of this first equation over here, then that works out to 35, divided by 3, multiplied by 10. I'll get to exactly what that is, minus 46.67, which is the payment, the earnout payment, and that works out to $69.99 million. Now, what this is it's a multiple. It effectively says that if Microsoft is, basically what it says is that the comparable company's market value is 10 times the operating cash flows per year. So this is kind of like an operating cash flow multiple, net operating cash flow multiple. So effectively what this entire thing is it's the market value based on the multiples minus the earnout payment. So from this entire arrangement, the shareholders of Microsoft are benefiting to the tune of $69.99 million. So effectively, it works out to a win-win situation for both the parties. So I've been speaking for a while, so let me pose this question for you. There is very positive incentive in this case. Microsoft is offering Wunderlist this earnout payment, which is conditional upon good performance. The shareholder value of Microsoft, if these multiples are correct, then multiple-based valuation is correct, is actually quite positive. There's an increase in the shareholder value. The management of Wunderlist benefits because they run the company really well, and the more they run the company well, they end up with a higher payment. Microsoft benefits because it has to pay a capped amount at $100 million, and it still benefits because the company is being run well. So given this particular arrangement, what might be the potential downsides of something like an earnout?
I think that the target firm can somehow improve the performance in the short run, not bearing in mind like destroying value in the long run for the company, for example, in detriment of improving the value in the short run to receive a higher payment.
That is exactly right. So this is a very short term. I'm just putting the asterisk here, and I don't have space to write, so I'm just moving this up. The immediate dimension is that the earnout is incentivized, the management is incentivized to increase the cash flow. But what is happening as a result is that the management might very well, the Wunderlist management that is, might very well take actions which might destroy value in the longer run. This might include just cutting your, say, number of employees or your cost in general, which are required ingredients for long-run performance. So this is a very short-run instrument. It is just going to create a lot of short-run value for the acquirer, but not so much in the longer run. So this is a major downside of something like an earnout. And as a management, that is something that you have to think about before you embed this kind of an option into the payment. So if everything is clear, let's move on to the third type of an option.
Actually, I have a doubt.
Oh.
Sorry.
No,
I don't
go
get
ahead.
it, but you. Sorry, go ahead.
It's just about the 35 divided by 3 times 10. Where that does come from? I didn't understand.
So this 35 divided by 3 is basically this 15 plus this 10 plus this 10. Now, if you add these 3 up, that is the 3 excesses, then those work out to 35. So this is 15 plus 10 plus 10. And obviously, it's per year because this is a 3-year value and you never calculate a multiples-based valuation based on 3 years. So what you instead do is you identify the per year value, which gives you this. Now you multiply that with the multiple, and that gives you the actual shareholder increase on an annual basis.
And the 10, the times 10?
So that is a multiple. So what a multiple is it's a ratio of comparable firms, typically within your own industry or even in your own market segment, of their market value to certain particular, ratio of the company. In this case, that the denominator would be the operating cash flow. So when you multiply that operating cash flow of comparable companies by your own operating, the multiple of comparable companies by your operating cash flow, you get a potential value of your, potential market value essentially.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I believe there was one more question.
Yeah, it was regarding the first calculation. I didn't get it why you were averaging out the excess cash flows.
Because that is the agreement. So in this case, it is 4 times, I should potentially say it should 4 times the excess annual net operating cash flows. So what you do is that you identify the cash flows per year, and then you add them up and divide them by 3. So that is the agreement that 4 times the average annual net operating cash flows, that would be your payment. Yeah?
It was actually the average excess at the end of the period. Is it? Because you're not multiplying by 4 each year's excess. You're averaging out the excesses and then multiplying by 4, right?
Yes, exactly. So you're taking out the average over the 3 years, average excess over the 3 years and multiplying that by 4. Yeah.
Okay.
It really depends on the precise terms. This is not like the only set way that you can have an earnout. There could be multiple ways.
Okay, it was just that the first time I read it, I understood it quite differently. I thought it was 4 times each year's excess. Just
Okay.
trying to understand. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So
I have a doubt. How do you get the value of the multiple? It is given, or should we have to calculate it?
So in this case, it will be given. Yeah, thank you. So in this case, it has been given, but typically what happens is that, I mean, I would not imagine a scenario where you have to do this sort of calculation and you have to identify the multiple value unless it's arising out of somewhere. Typically, if you're an analyst, as an example, this multiple value is something that you would be calculating. So in this case, I've just given you a particular value. It could be anything, but I cannot imagine, for instance, in the exam where you have to sit and calculate the multiple as well, and then you have to do this additionally as a separate thing. That would be a very long and tedious calculation. In practice, these are just values that many analysts already have computed or do compute. But that's perfectly fine because you have multiple analysts working on one report. Yeah?
Yeah, thanks.
So let's move on to the last 2 types of options. Now, the first type of an option was built upon a private company which, as an example, is not completely transparent about its assets. So you have information asymmetry about the assets of the company. The second one was about the performance of the company. Say you might anticipate some post-integration troubles, or you might anticipate some sort of issue with the performance of the company. Then in that case, you might embed that option. Now, this type of an option, that's contingent value rights, typically is built upon payment. So when you make the payment, if you're making it in the form of stock, then you might want to protect yourself as both an acquirer as well as a target. Contingent value right, I must start off with saying this is not a very widely used method of engaging in embedding option. What is far more common is a collar agreement. But nonetheless, it's one particular way where payment can be, amount which is to be paid can be controlled, or you can put a limit on both sides by just having this sort of an option. So the idea of a contingent value right is just that, well, let me think of an example. Yeah, so let's imagine we have the infamous now example of Facebook and Instagram. Actually, no, that would be a bad example in this case. Let me think of something else. Let's think of, say, Microsoft and Skype. So Microsoft wants to take over Skype. Now, the management of Microsoft believes that its own share are thoroughly undervalued, and it is making the payment to Skype using a stock-for-stock swap. So what Microsoft does, as an example, suppose their shares are worth $90 per share, and it believes that the real value in the market should be something like 100 per share. It might just pay with its undervalued share. Now, of course, that doesn't perfectly meet logic, but what happens is that if it believes that it's undervalued, embedding this option and paying with shares, if it does not have cash at disposal, might automatically protect it against, might protect it against a scenario where, the target might ask for additional payment. So if it believes that this 90 per share is too little, it's already undervalued. And if it truly believes that 100 per share is the real value, then in that case, what it can do is it can embed an option which says that if the value of Microsoft falls below 80 per share, then it's going to pay, say, an additional $10 per share in cash. Now, this can be both cash as well as stock, but saying cash in this case is easier than coming up with ratios. So it can just offer this additional $10 if the share price per share falls below $80. So in this case, from the acquirer's perspective, that is from Microsoft's perspective, it is not at all worried about this option being exercised, quite simply because from its private information, it believes that the real value is something like $100 per share. So in that sense, this $90 per share or even the threshold is like a floor, and the acquirer is very confident that it's not going to go below the floor. Now, one of the very simple reasons why this is not used is because of the fact that most management typically don't, first of all, it's, so from the perspective of a management, typically they do not see their own shares as too undervalued. And secondly, it's also the case that then it would be better to pay with cash instead of paying with stock if it believes that its shares are undervalued. So this is one particular way, but it's not very widely used. A more common way of paying is something called a collar agreement. Collar agreement is exactly like an option. It's kind of like two options put on top of each other. So when you're paying with cash, with stock, and let's go back to this Facebook, Instagram example. So $700 million were paid in stock in this case. You can come up with two types of arrangements. You can first keep the exchange ratio constant, that is the number of shares of acquirer to number of shares of target. That remains constant. So this is like an X value. And the second way you can do this is where the dollar price per share, so dollar Facebook share value, remains fixed. So the first one is a fixed share agreement. So I'm just using these short forms here because I don't have enough space to write. And the second one is this fixed value agreement. So that's fixed value agreement, fixed share agreement. I'm just using abbreviations, but you get the idea. Now, what happened in the Facebook Instagram deal was they had a fixed share agreement. That's this one. And while the number of shares were constant, or the exchange ratio was constant, that is this value X, the share price of the acquirer fell, as a result of which this value of 700 million ended up with something much less. So in that sense, the target in this particular case ends up with a very high amount of risk, quite simply because it's not going to receive a fixed dollar amount. Now, in case of fixed value agreement, both the acquirer and the target do incur a lot of risk. The acquirer incurs risk because it has to issue a lot of shares if the share price falls. So suppose it's offering 20 and coming up with a corresponding exchange ratio, and now the share price has fallen down to something like 15. What happens is that it has to offer an exchange ratio which is larger than X. So it has to issue more shares compared to what it would have otherwise. So as the acquirer, you might actually end up diluting the base of your own ownership. From the perspective of the target, suppose that the value goes up. Oh, well, actually, not from the perspective of the target. This is mainly from the perspective of the acquirer. So, in both of these cases, one party is heavily exposed to risk when this payment is made with stock. And one solution to that is something like a collar agreement. So here I'll just introduce the collar agreements in a more abstract form, and then we will talk about it in precise examples on the next slide. Essentially, there are two ways that a collar agreement can go through. The first one is where the exchange ratio remains fixed, as long as the price remains within a given range. The second one is where the dollar value remains fixed, so long as the price remains within a given range. So let us consider an example where the, I don't know, so 75 per share is being offered when the payment is being made, and the exchange ratio is something like 1.5. The floating collar agreement will say that so long as the share price remains between 60 per share and between, say, 80 per share, this is just a very random example. Actually, given that this is 15, let's just make this 90 per share. The target is going to receive an exchange ratio of 1.5. Once it exceeds this limit, so say the share price goes above this, the target is just going to start receiving this 90 per share. And once it goes down, it's going to receive something like 60 per share. And these values are typically determined based on the 10 to 20 day period preceding the closing date, because you do need some benchmark on the basis of which you're going to set these limits. So to give you a very precise example of a collar agreement, let us consider this case where you have an exchange ratio of 0.05. So what was the example? Facebook and Instagram. That was the one that we started with. Facebook is, for instance, offering Instagram an exchange ratio of 0.5 as long as the price of the acquirer is between 30 and 40 in this 20-day period before closing as in closing of the deal. Now, that is the agreement. And what it says over here is that the collar is $15 and $20 per target share. So where does this collar arise from? Because what we have set up over here is $30 and $40 per share.
It's the half.
Exactly. And why is it the half?
Because the exchange ratio is 0.5.
Exactly. So this is just 0.5 times 30, or the exchange ratio, and this is once again 0.5 times 40 in the 20-day period before closing. Now, let's put this down a bit like this. 40, or in terms of the target, it's 20, and here's 0.5, and then here it's 30, and in terms of the target, it's 15, so this is 30. Now, if the acquirer price goes below this, then the target is going to receive a guaranteed $15 per share. If the acquirer price goes above this 40 threshold, then the target is going to receive a guaranteed $20 per share. To put this back into the perspective of Facebook Instagram example, Instagram is going to receive a particular value as guaranteed when the upper threshold is breached. And it's also going to receive a particular value guaranteed when the lower threshold is reached. Now, this protects Instagram, which is the target, that is the lower threshold, because their payment is guaranteed at the lower threshold. From the perspective of Facebook, it is protected at the upper threshold because it's incurring risk. It's basically managing the risk at the lower threshold. So, in other words, both the parties are kind of canceling out risk equally amongst themselves. Facebook doesn't have to pay too much. Instagram does not have to pay, does not receive too little. So, in that sense, these are like two options which cancel each other out. But at the same time, what they do is they create this nice little collar in which the payment will stay. Now, the second way that this collar agreement can go through is, as an example, if Facebook had offered Instagram, say, $20 per share. And how does it offer $20 per share when it's paying with stock? So how can it fix a dollar amount if Facebook is paying Instagram in stock? Because stock prices notoriously vary. So how does it really ensure that it's $20 per share which is being paid as opposed to something else? So in a stock for stock swap, there are two dimensions. The first one is the share price, and the second one is the exchange ratio. If exchange ratio is fixed, then the share price is allowed to vary. If the share price is fixed, then the exchange ratio has to vary. So if Facebook is offering $20 per share to Instagram as a guaranteed dollar amount, then it's going to vary the exchange ratio of Instagram to Facebook shares. So between this threshold of 15, that's the upper threshold, these are very arbitrary thresholds, by the way, and the value of 10, Facebook is going to offer Instagram $20 per share. And these are acquirer prices, by the way. And the exchange ratio is allowed to vary in this case. Once we move past this upper threshold or the lower threshold, the exchange ratio becomes fixed. Or in other words, the actual share price or the dollar amount is allowed to vary. So once again over here, the upper limit protects the acquirer because it never has to issue more than a certain amount. So the dilution of the base of ownership for Facebook is limited. And from the perspective of the target, it's protected because it never receives fewer than a certain number of shares. So in both cases, that is the first case where the share price is allowed to vary. In the second case, where the exchange ratio is allowed to vary, in both of these cases, both these parties, that's the acquirer as well as the target, with each one of the callers is kind of protecting themselves against risk. The acquirer has the risk of paying too much or diluting its ratios ownership base too much. The target has the risk of receiving too little. So in the Facebook Instagram case, which is already mentioned in the deal book reading, they could have created some sort of collar agreement whereby they could have mitigated the risk of receiving far too little. So the eventual share price, the eventual payment went from 1 billion to something like 735. With a collar agreement, it could have been capped at something like 900 million. So even if you incur a loss of 100 million, you're still not incurring too much of a loss. Your loss is not unbounded, in other words. So is everything clear till this point? If not, then just unmute yourself and ask any question. Okay. There are other ways of embedding these options within the entire payment method. One of them is staged payout, which is very similar to an earnout. The payment is contingent on achieving a particular goal. Now, the main difference is that in an earnout, say where Microsoft took over Wunderlist, Wunderlist became a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft before the earnout payment was made. In this case, the transfer of control is gradual. Otherwise, these are very similar instruments. So in case of a staged payout, the transfer is gradual. In case of an earnout, the transfer is immediate, and Wunderlist in that case would become a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft. So what we have covered so far are the different types of options and how to calculate an exchange ratio. From the perspective of the exam, and this is not just going to be a particular, calculation which is going to stand on its own, it's going to be a part of an overall valuation. Just like the first case where you had to calculate the exchange ratio, you will also be required to calculate, say, the earnout, comment potentially on the risk sharing between the parties, and given the specifics of the case, you might be required to talk about, say, how to mitigate the risk, who is ending up with more risk given the fundamentals of the company. Because what we have done so far is talk about these things in terms of just figures. But when we talk about these companies in terms of actual environments that they operate in, many times having a certain amount of risk is more than justified if most of the synergies are coming from, say, the acquirer or the target. What we will also try to do is that before we move to the exam itself, we will have two case studies, at least two case studies, and you will obviously have your group assignment, which time permits, we will discuss in class. Otherwise, I'll upload a recording, much like I uploaded a recording of this particular lecture last time, so that you have an idea of what to expect come the exam. Okay, so what I would propose at this moment is we take, say, a 15 or 20-minute break. So right now it's 10:50. We have been in this class for roughly 70 minutes. So not actually 70 minutes, 80 minutes. So what I propose is that we have a 15-20-minute break and we return at 11:10. And then we can proceed by talking about a bit more of what the target can do. We can move to this mini case study, which is that of ArcelorMittal, and then we can finally move to talking about valuation. Unfortunately, I cannot do the Excel spreadsheet exercise to avoid, rushing through any example this time, but that is something that I will cover next time for certain. Also, what I will assign you at the end of this class is, and via an announcement, is a case study, which is a Heinz case study. So I'll see you back at 11:10, and I'll just be offline for a little bit.
Professor, I have. Can I ask?
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
I have a question about the case study we have. I can't find the instruction on Moodle. It's online, so we have to do it just today. We only have this day to do it. Or
No. Don't worry about that. So what I will be doing is that I'll put up an announcement. I think I'll put up the announcement tomorrow, mainly so that there will be a bit more of time. Basically, I'll be putting up another announcement today for the group assignment, so there'll be less confusion. But this is going to be a case study which is a Heinz case study, and you just have to click a link, and it will take you to the Harvard Business School website, and you can automatically access it. Now, the one for your assignment, it's a bit more convoluted, but that's already there in the assignment thing, which is going to be unlocked at 1 o'clock.
all right, but the deadline is not today. It's not like.
No. Don't worry about that. So there's no deadline. It's not created. It's just so that we have a bit more of a hands-on approach to doing all this valuation, because unfortunately there's a lot of descriptive stuff which goes on before, but then we have to reach a bit more of actually applying a lot of these things that we are doing right now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Professor.
Yeah. Hi.
Sorry. Can I just ask something very quick related with the fixed exchange rate agreement, exchange share agreement? Sorry. So you say in the slides that the risk here is mainly for the target because of fluctuations in the price of the acquirer, right? So if the price, for example, decreases, the payment will decrease as well. But could there be a risk for the acquirer as well if the price of the target increases? So in that sense, increasing the payment, or that risk doesn't exist in this case?
So if the exchange ratio is fixed, then in that case, if you're the acquirer, then the worst that has really happened is that you would rather like to have a lower exchange ratio because your shares are worth more. But as the acquirer per se, you don't have to issue any more shares, so you're not risking any dilution of your own ownership base anymore. And as this is just the market fluctuation, it is the market which has to compensate the target's shareholders should they decide to sell. So as the acquirer, you don't have to make any payment. You already have agreed to a given ratio, which might not be fair now, given that the actual the share price has increased from your end, but as such you're not incurring any risk. The only way I think where I can think of, perhaps someone else also has some scenario which they have, or you have thought of a scenario where there might be some more risk, is where if the synergies have been miscalculated and the market then increases the price of the acquirer, which in turn leads to the idea that they actually agreed upon a very bad exchange ratio. But that's potentially the only way I think the acquirer ends up losing out when the exchange ratio is fixed.
Okay, it makes sense. Thank you.